This episode of The Shift is sponsored by LinkedIn. As a B2B marketer, you know how noisy the ad space can be. It's time you had a marketing platform built specifically for you. That's LinkedIn Ads, the platform where you can cut through the noise by precisely reaching the professionals who are more likely to find your ad relevant. Target your ideal audience by job title, industry, company, and more. Stand out with LinkedIn Ads and start converting your B2B audience into high-quality leads today. LinkedIn Ads allows you to build the right relationships, drive results, and reach your customers in a respectful environment. You'll have direct access to and build relationships with decision makers. There's 1 billion members, 130 million decision makers, and 10 million C-level executives. You'll be able to drive results with targeting and measurement tools built specifically for B2B. In technology, LinkedIn generated 2 to 5 times higher return on ad spend than other social media platforms. You'll work with a partner who respects the B2B world that you operate in. 79% of B2B content marketers said LinkedIn produces the best results for paid media. I mean, LinkedIn is the first place I turn if I want to know what the people who shape my industry are thinking. So whatever industry you work in, you'll find the brightest brains and ideas here. Start converting your B2B audience into high-quality leads today. We'll even give you $100 credit on your next campaign. Go to linkedin.com/theshift to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/theshift. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be. Hello and welcome to The Shift, the podcast that aims to tell the no-holds-barred truth about being a woman post-40. Created and hosted by me, writer and broadcaster Sam Baker. If you sometimes worry that you've left it too late to follow your heart, today's guest should give you hope. At 40, Jane Campbell got a divorce and took herself off to university, where she trained as a group analyst. 40 years later, at the age of 80, her first short story was published after she sent cat brushing to the London Review of Books on a whim. As a rule, they don't publish fiction, but less than 3 weeks later, they did just that. Cat brushing became the title of her debut short story collection, a short, sharp collection about the inner life of older women that I've read over and over again. The New York Times compared her to Edna Obrien and Muriel. I mean, no biggie. Now Jane's written a novel, Interpretations of Love, which is ultimately about the things left unsaid and their lifelong implications.
Although by nature it's become apparent in my life that I'm basically an optimist, I have a deep distrust of the damage that human beings can do to each other. Of course, it's easier to damage another human being if you have power. Maybe that's also why I'm not married, who knows?
From her home in Oxfordshire, Jane told me why it was so important to her to put the loves, lusts and losses of old women centre stage. We also discussed the impact of being a war baby and growing up with the belief that men were surplus to requirements, finding herself, a new life and a job she loved at 40, and doing it all over again at 80. The lure of the solitary life and how she learnt to stop asking permission in midlife and has never looked back. Thank you so much for coming on The Shift, Jane. I read Cat Brushing when it came out, and I reread Cat Brushing just because I could, because I had an excuse, and I love it. I absolutely love it, and I love all your, how do I put it without sounding like I'm just about to shoot myself in the foot? All your spiky old women.
Old women. What was the adjective?
All your spiky old women.
Spiky. Well,
I'm not sure that's the right word.
They're not all spiky. Some of them are very timid, like le mot perdu and so on and so forth. But they are all, I'm trying not to use a word I don't like, but I suppose I have to. I'd say they are feisty.
I hate the word feisty too.
Oh, so do I.
It's so, when have you ever heard a man described as feisty?
Exactly.
It's like, uppity, isn't it? It's like the way that women are always
I mean,
outspoken. Men are never
let's
outspoken.
cancel feisty. They are their own people. Means nothing really, but says something.
I mean, the reason I started the podcast was because I felt like, of course, I wasn't aware of it until I was in my 40s. But once I was in my 40s, I suddenly thought, oh, where's everybody gone? Where are all the older women's voices? And what struck me when I was reading Cat Brushing, I had this idea that you were kind of allowed to come back into the fold a bit once you were old, that you kind of vanish around about 50, 60. And then when you're 70, 80, you're allowed to come back. But then the more I thought about it and the more I read Cat Brushing, I thought only in a certain way, only if you're Miss Marple.
Well, I'm very fond of Miss Marple. I regard her as a role model. If we're living in Old Marston, I sort of look down Church Lane and wonder what my neighbours are doing. I think she's a great character. However, she did have some drawbacks as a character. She couldn't have been one of my old women.
Why not?
Well, partly because she belongs to someone else. But
yes,
to be honest, it sounds slightly pretentious, but I don't know where these characters came from. The settings are drawn from my own experience and are absolutely true to life. Bermuda, Africa, and so on. I think there's one up in Hoylake where I was born. And the old women I'd start off with a little bit of reality in my life, and then they just take off. They just appear. It sounds so silly. They sort of talk and I watch them with amazement and see where they go. I'm beginning to sound really eerie and spooky. I'm sorry about that.
No, not at all. Not at all. I want to talk a lot more about your old women and about giving them voice. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about you and what shaped you. So tell me a bit about your childhood growing up on the Wirral during the war.
Okay, I thought about it a lot, obviously, because I'm a group analyst, which means we use psychoanalytic theory in a group setting, which sounds utterly boring, but when you do it, it's rather interesting. And therefore, I've thought a lot about my first 5 years, which, of course, for a Freudian are pretty important. I grew up in a house, my great-grandmother's house, which was a sort of very comfortable, little bit grand house. She was married to my great-grandfather, who had been Lord Mayor of Liverpool. So there were sort of, traces of grandeur, big portraits and things. And my mother's mother had died when she was 13. So there was a great-grandmother, then there was her granddaughter, my mother, and then there was me. And I think we lived there very, very happily for 4 years during the war. It was very serene and I think shaped me a lot. I sort of grew up with the impression that mothers didn't need husbands and children didn't need fathers, because I didn't have a father, but I was perfectly happy. I knew my father was going to return. When he did return, I was thrilled to see him. We kind of fell in love with each other as strangers. And that was hard for my mother. And I do remember the impression that her life changed when my father came back. In a way, of course, it was wonderful. She had her husband back. But in another way, all her routine life, and she grew up with a very routine life, all her routines, her comfortable routines, were completely smashed. And he took us off first to Ipswich and then to the middle of Africa. She said to me once that she could have lived and died under the shade of the same elm tree. So it wasn't what she wanted.
How do you think that influenced your perspective on marriage and relationships?
Well, without drawing too direct, I mean, I've lived alone for 40 years and I know it suits me well. It suits my kind of character and my kind of background and my kind of interests. I'm sure it wouldn't suit everybody, but as you can see, I grew up with this very strong impression of women who were self-sufficient and coped. And it was, of course, a feature of the war that while the men were off fighting, the women got on with stuff. And then when the men came back, the women were sort of pushed out of all the jobs they'd had. I'm no social historian, but I believe that is a theme.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of having, I don't know, your own life and your own resources and, being
Exactly.
like the mother in Interpretations of Love, an ambulance driver, and
actually, my mother was an ambulance driver during the war.
was she as well?
Yes, there's more of my life in that book than in Cappuccin.
I was thinking that when you said about, meeting your father completely anew when he came back from the war, I was thinking, having read Interpretations of Love, that struck a chord. But the moment, without giving anything away about the book, because it would be very easy to spoiler, the idea that, she has driven an ambulance all through the war and yet automatically is expected to get into the passenger seat once there's a man in the picture. I think so many women will recognise that, of all ages, actually.
Probably, yes. It's the basis of mansplaining, isn't it?
So you went to Oxford, which was in my mind, it was very unusual at the time because, when I went to university in the 80s, still women were very much in a minority. So it must have been very unusual when you went in the 60s.
Yes, it was. There were 5 women's colleges at Oxford, and I think there were 26 men's. So certainly we were vastly outnumbered. I was also unusual in that I'd come from Cape Town, where I was first at school and then briefly went to the university. And I wrote the entrance exam in my former headmistress's dining room. And on the basis of that, they accepted me. And that was unusual. So when I got to Oxford, everybody thought I came from Australia, which drove me berserk because I had a very, very strong South African accent, which people couldn't, struggled. Oh, anyway, it was different. So yes, it was unusual. I was incredibly lucky. I loved my 3 years at Oxford, really loved them. They were life-changing for me.
And in what way were they life-changing?
I knew you were going to ask me that. I thought I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
So in order to understand me, you have to think of colonial life. So I was taken out to Africa by my father, age 6. And for the rest of my life, I had one ambition, which was to get back to England. So when I did get into Oxford, my primary thrill was, I'm going back to England. So part of the joy was, the mists of autumn, the dark, rain-swept pavements, the street lights, the gas fires. And all of these are sort of literary tropes in many books. And I'd read them, and there they were, and they were real. And here I was in this wonderful city, old city, with all these marvelous environmental elements. And in addition to that, I met a group of women, there were 7 of us reading English in that year, who had my interests. And they'd read lots of books I hadn't. I wasn't as well educated as they were. But, we all liked the same things. We all wanted to read and so on. We all smoked a lot, smoked and smoked, didn't drink a lot because we couldn't afford the alcohol, really. It was just another world. Wonderful tutors. Writing essays was a joy because they were so interesting. What's not to love?
I hope you don't mind me asking you this, but you were in Oxford and you had found yourself and you were having a wonderful time and you met a man and moved to Bermuda.
Well, the move wasn't immediate. So I did meet John. He was actually a year behind me because he's a year younger. But what we all did, and this is interesting, as women in Oxford, we all paired up with a boy during our time there. This was the 60s, we were very liberated. I had another boyfriend for the first 2 years, and he went down. And I remember there was a sort of expectation that I might marry him, and I suddenly realized that despite the fact we'd hitchhiked to Greece together for 6 weeks, I was really the thought of marrying him was awful, which sounds bizarre. I am summarizing. We broke up, and then I fell in love with somebody else in the Michaelmas term, and then I met John. Now, he's still alive, and he's in Bermuda, and he's a great guy. He's very good looking, very clever. He was a lawyer at New College, reading law at New College, and he was the most English man I had ever met, and classy with it. So I thought, this is my destination, and it turned out it was. You don't believe me, do you?
No, I do believe you. I'm just really interested I think, in the way that men's destinations become women's. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Now, when I met him, he'd never left England, apart from going up to Helensburgh, I think, or Edinburgh. Maybe it was Edinburgh or Glasgow. But anyway, he'd gone up north to visit his grandmother who lived there. Apart from that, he'd never left England. But it turned out that after he'd done his articles and he was working for a very large firm in London, Allen and Overy, he came back one day and said, darling, there were 23 partners at Allen and Overy, and it'll be an awfully long time before I can be one. I have some links, I have some contacts in Bermuda. How would you feel about going out there for a couple of years? And I said, of course, darling, of course, what fun, that would be lovely. So we went to Bermuda, and I wrote to my parents about this dear little island. It is incredibly small. Dear little island with all its subtropical vegetation, much of it, which was like growing up in the middle of Africa. But of course, 2 years is never 2 years. I left after 15.
Did you leave to come back to study, or did you come back to study because you left?
I left because I think really, I think I divorced Bermuda. I mean, my husband was going to go on to and has had a wonderfully successful and prominent career there. But there was nothing there for me apart from my children and him, I suppose. But by then I was very disenchanted. And so I came back, but I always, my brain, it's not such an amazing brain, but I needed to do something. So I did a second degree. I was very fortunate. And yes, I mean, I did have a house in Oxford because we bought a house because the plan was to return. It was always postponed.
And he and your children are still there and you commute?
Well, my children came with me and went to school. I mean, the youngest was only 3. It was very hard on him. My eldest daughter at that time, I think, was 12 or 13. They went to school. I took them out of their boarding schools, apart from my son, who wanted to stay on and go on to his next school. And but I was there. I could see them often. They were, whenever a plane ride away, they were a car journey away. And we lived there very happily. But the girls had grown up there. And they both married third-generation Bermudians that they knew as children. And my son, Nicholas, went back there, I think because financially it's a wonderful place to work. I mean, you can make quite a lot of money, tax haven, if you're in the financial services industry. And my other son too.
Which son is the cat brushing son?
That's Nicholas.
Is he the eldest or the youngest?
Oh, he's the middle. I have 2 daughters. And then Nicholas, and he was actually born in Bermuda. The girls were born in England. And yes, and that is his house. It's right down to the last detail. And he did have, okay, I know where you're going with this.
No, I'm assuming he wouldn't just get rid of the cat, so.
Okay, he had 2 Siamese cats. And I've said to people he'd rather shot me than got rid of the cats. But he had one that was Lucy, who was not his very, very favourite cat. It was Sarah. But Lucy loved being brushed. And one of my jobs when I was there on holiday for a couple of weeks was to brush Lucy. And I was kneeling on the kitchen floor and brushing Lucy and seeing how she stretched her back and sort of arched it. And gradually this old woman emerged in my head who was housebound, very dependent. And my son does have a wonderful wife who is nothing like the wife in there. She's not much younger at all. And she, it's so all the characters are invented, but the setting and the cat is real.
And that way, that cats lean into pleasure.
Oh gosh, yes, absolutely. And I did start wondering, does she remember this, or does she look back on it as, wow, didn't she give me a lovely brush this morning? Obviously, I think it's very unlikely. And then my imagination wandered.
Hello there. Welcome to Sketch. Welcome to Sketch Out Loud, where we invite you on a journey to explore the many hidden rooms and experiences within this 18th century townhouse at 9 Conduit Street in the heart of London. Opened in 2002 by restaurateur Murad Mazouz and master chef Pierre Gagnère, Sketch is a destination for food, music, drink and art. Meet our chefs, artists, designers, guests and many more who have contributed to the ever-developing story of Sketch over the past 2 decades. Listen and follow now wherever you find your podcasts. Sketch. Eat, music, drink, art.
You kind of started your professional life at around about 40, and then you reinvented again at 80. It's very impressive.
Well, thank you. It doesn't feel impressive. It just feels very lucky, very fortunate. And it's not a complete reinvention because I did my degree in English language and literature at Oxford. And when I moved into psychological work, psychiatric work, psychotherapeutic work, that little category, some people said, it was a strange transition. And I said, no, it's not. It's absolutely straightforward. It's stories about people. So having studied all the poems and books and stuff, in my late teens, and then to go back and do another degree and start moving into psychological work seemed to me just another, tiny step. And then to write stories about them just seemed to me another tiny step. So they do seem joined up to me.
Is that what attracted you to analysis, the story?
And the people. Group analysts they're a very interesting group of people.
I had to look it up. I didn't, for some reason, I thought this says more about me than it says about you, but I thought a group analyst was somebody who worked in corporate data or something.
Sadly, I think loads of people do think that. Actually, I truly believe that it is the most profound form of therapy. I wish it were better known, but it's got a vivid and busy training in London. Yeah, it can, of course, be adapted in all kinds of ways, but don't get me started. I could talk about it for an hour.
Well, but tell me what's special about it. What's special about it for you as the analyst?
Well, what I liked about it is the distribution of power. And although in my, I sort of talk in my book about a psychoanalyst in my novel. The thing I really like about groups is that everyone in the group is both therapist and patient. So the therapeutic medium is the group. The group analyst conducts the group, is the word we use, and their job is to enable the group to work at its fullest potential. But the therapy comes from and through the group and its members. And therefore, nobody is talked down to. There's no power balance. I do think the group analyst has to have a lot of authority, but it's used in order to implement interaction in the group. Am I making it sound attractive?
Yes, you are. It sounds really interesting. And I think that the thing about the power balance in particular.
I have enormous dislike of power. I don't mind exercising it, of course, but I don't. Sorry, I mustn't make jokes. People take me seriously.
You talk about power. What's your experience of that? What is it? Why do you think you don't like it? I mean, it sounds perfectly reasonable to me, but I'm just interested.
I suppose because although by nature it's become apparent in my life that I'm basically an optimist, I have a deep distrust of the damage that human beings can do to each other. Of course, it's easier to damage another human being if you have power. And I don't trust any political system. I'm really delighted Keir Starmer is Prime Minister. But I don't, every political system has, I have to be very careful to say, has its issues and so on. So I'm no idealist as far as that is concerned. And I just dislike the idea of somebody being in complete charge of me. Maybe that's also why I'm not married. Who knows?
Yes. Yes. Well, I was thinking, the power imbalance, not necessarily in all marriages, but in a lot, is a thing that a lot of much younger women have been drawing attention to.
Exactly. I think they should. I think they should. I think it's a really good thing that they do.
I think in cat brushing, it's not so much power imbalance is explicit, but one of the things that struck me was the number of your old women and so many of the women I speak to who have spent most of their lives living inside the lines or a box that someone else made for them.
Yes, indeed. I mean, like, who is he? Because mothers do this. Who is my sad little person? 183 minutes, I think it is, who meets this man on the train who turns out to be no good at all. But she senses romance and freedom and fun, which she's never had because her mother somehow always spoiled her life. And then there's Kiskadee, where Pamela has obviously been enthralled to her father throughout her life. And yes, it's true. I think it happened and probably happens, but may happen less now. I don't know.
I don't know. I want to think it happens less, but I don't know.
The trouble is, Sam, to resist it, you need a degree of power. When you have no power, you submit to anything that's going to feed you.
Yeah, and to step outside it, you need power. You need economic power. You need to be able to step outside it. Do you think once having got divorced and trained as a group analyst, having created your own narrative, it would have been impossible to give that up?
Yes, I think it would. I didn't know where I was heading, but yes, it would.
Tell me about the process of writing Cat Brushing and getting from, a short story written in your son's amazing house to
it is an amazing
the physical book, the wonderful physical book.
Well, I sent it to the London Review of Books because I'm just a worshipper of the magazine and have been devoted to it all my life, ever since I found it. And they don't accept fiction. So it was an enormous chutzpah that led me to do it, but changed everything because the then editor, Mary K. Wilmer, wrote to me within 3 weeks and said she wanted to publish it and asked me if it was my own story and so on. Anyway, so it got published. And then Alice Spalls, who at that point was an associate editor, now she is, I think, the editor, introduced me to a colleague of hers who became the wife of a colleague of hers who became my agent, Eleanor Byrne. And Eleanor said to me, "Jane, you seem to be quite good at writing about old women. Can you write about any more?" So I went off with the task of writing more about old women. And then to my great delight, to my enormous delight, I can't tell you how grateful I am, they just flooded into my mind. I didn't have to work on them very hard. Some people might say it shows, but they just turned up. I love them all. I'm deeply in love with them because they don't, they're not me. They are other. They are themselves.
They are absolutely wonderful. Even the sad ones. I mean, obviously you were encouraged by your agent to write about old women, but was there, it's so rare to hear about the interior lives of older women and older women. And it really made me realize that when I was reading it, how rarely you find yourself behind the eyes of an old woman looking out.
They're usually somebody's mother or aunt or sister, some peripheral character. There've been a lot of interesting old women in my life. So this gives me a chance to say, I think some people have noticed that there are young women in some of these stories whom the old women are very attached to. I think I was that young woman in a number of old women's lives when I was much younger. So when I was a child, I used to be taken to visit ancient aunts. And I can't remember them in any detail really, but I think I just got this impression of a very interesting solitary life, and I liked it, and they were nice to me, and I liked them back, and that was really at the beginning. And then later on, I went to boarding school in Cape Town, and there were two matrons there who were interesting old women. And my headmistress was a very interesting old woman, slightly mad, I think. And then I came to Oxford and there were these tutors who'd never married, because in those days, I think if you married, you couldn't work there or something. Brilliant women, brilliant. So interesting, enormous hinterland of education and thought. So then they were there. And then it sort of went on through my life that I was drawn to the company of older women because I just liked them. So in a weird sense, I was doing research for this book all my life. I mean, it sounds a bit pretentious, but I'd always been drawn to their company. And in fact, I had an elderly neighbour when I came to Oxford, and I lived for 25 years in Kennington. A remarkable old woman lived next door who I used to go and visit and became very fond of. And it's a theme in my life.
Is there a sense of wanting to bring them to life a bit? It feels to me, and I'm sure lots of people will tell me I'm wrong, but I do feel that old women are sidelined in a way old men aren't.
They are, I think. And I think that's a very astute question. I think I was trying to brighten up their lives a bit. Probably started when I was a little girl and, I knew how to be cute. I'm sure I was a poisonous little brat, actually. But, yes, I think there was a knowledge that I could do something. My company could enhance their lives. And then, of course, then I write Susan and Miffy, where this young girl doing work experience brightens the life of this sad old woman, Susan, by painting her nails. So it's a rather graphic representation of that. But to be honest, Sam, I hadn't thought about it like that before. So it's an excellent question. Thank you.
I mean, Susan, you start with Susan and Miffy starts the book, and it feels like a statement of intent because, Susan we don't see much about desire, old people's desire at all, but particularly old women's desire.
I would say never, probably somewhere, but yeah, well, that was the second story I wrote, because the other thing that happened when Cat Brushing was published in the London Review was Sigrid Rousing got hold of me. She ran Granta then and asked me if I would write a story for her. And I wrote Susan and Miffy. I'm not sure really I never knew where they came from, but I do sometimes. I'm going to get all pedantic for a moment and say, if I were to teach a class about Susan and Miffy, I would ask them who Miffy is. The brightest spark in the class, which is probably you, would say she is Susan's young self, because she looks at Miffy and she sees how beautiful and her skin and her hair and the way she moves and everything. And she says to herself, that is youth. She realizes that she was young once, and I wanted her to realize that she never knew how beautiful she was, ever. Miffy is a representation of that. Because Miffy kisses her, some people imagine that it's a mutual relationship. In fact, it's extremely unequal. Susan is consumed by a belated realization of the beauty of flesh and the joy of sensual contact. Miffy is simply a young girl overflowing with compassion. And she sees what Susan needs and responds. So in no way is it, there's nothing sexual at all from Miffy. She's just a warm-hearted, lovely young girl. But for Susan, it's a revelation.
When I was thinking about it, it reminded me when I interviewed the novelist Helen Garner, and she said, which has always stuck with me ever since I spoke to her, she said, I don't miss the male gaze, I miss the human gaze.
Very relevant to Susan, yes.
And it made me think when I was reading Susan and Miffy, but actually not just Susan and Miffy, that it's not so much about sexual desire, but about yearning to be seen.
Gosh, you and mine, you're a bit of a star, really, in terms of picking up the important points, which I haven't always formulated like that at all. But yes, and I will just intersperse a little thought here, that I believe the primary curative factor of psychotherapy, one-on-one, is that the adults, I don't know how long and I won't ask you that. So an adult sits there and gets the completely undivided, empathic gaze and company of another person. And to have this, for this length of time, this focus, this, you don't have to ask questions back. It's not about sharing. It's just about talking. And I think, long before we get to all the theories, I really do think that's pretty curative.
That's a good point. I can't remember. I can't even remember which book I saw it in. I think it is Cat Brushing. You talk about aging as a process of dispossession.
I do. It is actually cat brushing, yeah.
It is cat brushing. What has been your own experience of aging?
Well, again, I have been lucky. I can see the dispossession. My body shape has changed. My skin is... I never had very brilliant skin, actually, but it's all crumpled and speckly, and my ghastly hair is even thinner, and so on. However, I have not yet had one of those massive strokes of misfortune, which might be a stroke. In terms of my health, I have as yet no health issues. And I've had my cataracts done in my eyes so I can see. And I don't have hearing problems. I don't walk as fast or as far as I used to. My balance is not great. But otherwise, I've sort of reasonably unscathed. So I haven't lost, but I haven't lost enormously as many of my contemporaries have. Yeah.
And what about in societal terms? How have you felt the way you're perceived and treated change?
That also is interesting. We're having a lot of building work done here around us, around our village. I think that the people that are organizing it have seen me. Admittedly, I might have had to work at it, but I think...
Did you make them tea or something?
No, I don't do that. I don't come over. No, I write them sharp letters, copy everyone in. And so I think, but it is a fight. I don't take it for granted. I mean, if I were an 82-year-old retired admiral, I probably wouldn't have to bother. They just come in and chat to me. But actually, it's so unfair to say. I hope they never listen to this. But
I'm sure they won't.
It is true. One does become invisible. But that, of course, is Miss Marple's great strength. And in that sense, I think she's such an admirable invention because it is so true. So she has this great brain and she can do things under the radar. So she uses it to her advantage.
Have you done that?
I mean, I'm probably pretty invisible and I probably don't notice it that much because, I'm very self-absorbed. That's why I write stories.
And one interview I read with you, you said about stopping asking for permission as you got older. And I wondered how old you were when you stopped asking for permission.
Probably around the time I got divorced, which would be almost 40. It's very difficult to know. I just decided I could. And so I just did. And I didn't have to answer to anyone else, you see. I think when you get much older, you have to answer to your adult children, which can be a bit of a shock. But I didn't have to answer to anyone. So I just stopped asking permission. You're thinking of society's permission and things.
No, just in general. No, that's interesting. But my brain, just when you mentioned your adult children, I immediately thought of your characters who are imprisoned in care homes. And
I know. Well, I want to tell you that those are total inventions. Yeah. I do have 4 adult children. They are wonderful people and they are incredibly tolerant and kind to me. All of them, I mean, in very different ways, because they're very unlike each other as well. So it's not about them. But I can see how it could happen. And I think it's true. I think it can happen. That, for example, who is it? Nell, when she has this, there's a degree of fetishism.
Is this the phantasm woman?
No, it's not the phantasm woman. It's the one who obviously had this sensual experience with a young woman in a hotel in Melbourne, and then never did anything with it. Was happily married, obviously had a good sex life with her husband, and then is left alone. It's called The Scratch, and she starts cutting herself because there's blood. I mean, it is a slightly bizarre story, but I really like it because I think it's got a sort of basic truth. And it's the son-in-law who comes, we should have come much earlier. In fact, she died happy. She died happy in a sort of ecstasy of, blood and, she died happy. She'd never been allowed to do that in a nursing home.
I mean, death, you very handily gave me a nice segue to my death question. It does play quite a large, it is, I suppose, inevitably omnipresent in both your books, but we're still, I think, in society, so uncomfortable about talking about it when it's a fact of life.
I don't think I'd realised that. Of course, it's always part of analytic work. Well, if you're my age, I'm definitely in my last decade, or maybe in my last few years. There's just no, it's there. It's just there, and it doesn't horrify me. So, I think there are basically two subjects in literature: love and death.
And you've got both of those in spades.
Yes,
in both books.
Of course. And I was born during a war, and I believe in the early impressions, and death was all around us. My story starts, as indeed probably was my life, during the Liverpool Blitz. So my parents were married during the Liverpool Blitz.
You were described to me as formidable.
Really?
Yes. And I was quite scared, and I soon realised not to be. Do you think that is another word like feisty, that it's a word that we use to describe a label that we put on older women who don't quite fit one of our, she's a granny, or what's the other option for an old woman? Like a mad purple woman, maybe,
Jenny, yes. So I'm going to diverge a bit here because I don't mind being called formidable or formidable. You see, when you asked me, do I feel invisible? I think I don't, because I think I work quite hard at being formidable, as being a difficult, arsey woman. Not loud, but a bit Miss Marple-like in my determination. I don't think I'm formidable at all, but I don't mind the reputation.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the questions that I always ask at the end. What's your emotional age?
I think I'm 45. I think when I was 18, I was 45, because in a curious way, I never had a teenage life. For a start, I wasn't living at home. I was living in Cape Town. So I think I grew up very quickly. And then I stopped at 45 emotionally, because it was just such a good time. And one of my best friends recently gave me a birthday card saying, growing old is compulsory, but growing up is optional. And I think, in a sense, I still act like I'm 45 when I can.
Give us a book recommendation.
Oh, this is hard. I haven't read novels for years. I don't read novels.
That's okay. Anything is fine. Could be a cookbook. I don't mind.
The Oxford, it's going to sound a bit, Oxford Book of 20th Century English Verse, edited by Philip Larkin. This book goes everywhere with me. It has hundreds of little bookmarks. It has all of human life in it, and yet it's all 20th century. And I recommend it to anyone who's interested in people.
That's a good recommendation. What advice would you give younger women?
Don't listen to anyone. Don't ask for advice. Make up your own mind. Choose your own parameters. Do it your own way. Don't let anyone tell you what to do.
I think you're the living embodiment of that, aren't you? After 45. It reminds me of, I think, one of the best bits of advice I was ever given, and it was actually when I was trying to run a business and not being very good at it. But it was that basically all advice is just someone else's opinion. So form your own.
Form your own. Of course, one of the frustrating things about this format is I keep wanting to ask you questions that I don't ask. But
you're allowed.
what was your childhood like?
Oh, good Lord.
That's what I mean. It's sort of
Yeah.
like, I don't, probably we haven't time, but you are someone I would have liked to have known better.
Oh, thank you. I'm very flattered. Well, we can carry on afterwards. I don't mind. Who is your old bird role model?
Now, this is really easy. It's Glenda Jackson. She was born in Hoylake. I was going to look it up, but certainly a few years before me. But she struck me as a woman who just did not take prisoners. No bullshit. You didn't mess with her. At one point, they were going to vote her the most beautiful woman in the world. And when she had her makeup on, she could be glorious. But when she was not on screen, she didn't give a fuck what she looked like. And as she aged, she just aged. No artificial anything, as far as I could tell. I think maybe she colored her hair. I loved her intelligence and her wit and her uncompromising attitude to life, as far as I could tell it. I've never read a biography, but I like the fact that we were born in the same place, and she went to the school that I would have gone to if I'd continued living in Hoylake. So Glenda Jackson.
That's a very good choice. What's your superpower?
I wasn't sure whether this was meant to be our ideal superpower. I guess it is.
It can be either. I've had some people say, being able to teleport, and I've had someone say getting a roast dinner on the table with everything hot at the same time. So it can be literally anything.
I'm an absolutely atrocious cook and I hate it, so that wouldn't be me. It's very straightforward. I just like to be able to fly. I've always wanted to be able to fly. Probably a quite large bird with a big wingspan so I could ride the currents of the air above the ocean. I just want to be able to fly.
Would you fly somewhere in particular, or would you just fly for joy?
Both. I would fly. I'd fly to Bermuda. Probably from time to time. I'd fly up to Scotland. I'd fly to Ireland. I just would like to fly.
And last one, how many fucks do you give?
Well, it depends. I care a lot about my immediate family and people I love, and would never want to offend or distress them, although I'm sure I do from time to time. But as far as the general public goes, and I think that's what you're asking me as an author, nothing. I don't give a damn. I don't give a flying fuck. Because when I wrote these books, or when I write books, I write them for myself. I write the books that I would like to read. I realize I probably have an incredibly small category of readership, and I'm distressed if my publishers lose money on me, which I think they might. But I write for myself. And if people like it, I'm delighted. But if they don't, that's just too bad.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy The Shift and would like to show your appreciation, why not buy me a coffee? Go to www.buymeacoffee.com/The Shift with Sam Baker. You can hear a new episode of The Shift every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please do rate, review, follow, tell your friends, because it really does help other people find us. And if you'd like to know more about my own experience of shifting, my book, The Shift, How I Lost and Found Myself After 40, and you can too, is out now in paperback.
Hello there. Welcome to Sketch.
Welcome to Sketch Out Loud, where we invite you on a journey to explore the many hidden rooms and experiences within this 18th century townhouse at 9 Conduit Street in the heart of London. Opened in 2002 by restaurateur Muriel and master chef Pierre Gagnère, Sketch is a destination for food, music, drink and art. Meet our chefs, artists, designers, guests, and many more who have contributed to the ever-developing story of Sketch over the past 2 decades. Listen and follow now wherever you find your podcasts. Sketch. Eat, music, drink, art.